The world is not breaking. It is being redesigned, quietly, systematically, out of sight. No tanks, no speeches, no single headline, just minerals you never see. Tariffs you don't notice until prices rise. Treaties expiring without ceremony. Power grids replacing oil fields. Aid budgets erased with a signature. And suddenly, everything feels more expensive, more dangerous, more fragile. In 2026, power will not belong to who shouts the loudest. It will belong to who controls supply chains, electricity, weapons limits, and survival itself. China already understands this. So does Washington. So do the people who will pay the price, often without knowing why. This is not a prediction. It is already happening. If you want analysis that cuts through noise and explains the world as a system, not a slogan, stay with me. Subscribe if this perspective matters to you, because before crises explode, they take shape quietly. And the first shape appears underground. Look closely, and a pattern emerges. What defines 2026 is not one crisis. It is pressure applied everywhere. At the same time, governments are no longer just managing economies. They are managing dependencies, minerals, trade routes, energy systems, security guarantees, aid flows. Each decision now carries a second effect. And a third, restrict mineral exports and factories stall, raise tariffs, and inflation shifts from companies to households, let arms control expire, and numbers on paper turn into weapons on alert. Electrify faster, and power moves from oil wells to grids. Cut aid, and survival becomes gendered. These forces interact, they amplify each other, they move faster than public debate. What makes this moment dangerous is not intent, it is simultaneity. The world is entering an era where small policy changes trigger large systemic shocks. Not overnight, but relentlessly. To understand the year ahead, we need to trace how we got here. Not emotionally, mechanically, because every system has an origin point. And this one begins with scarcity. To understand scarcity, we have to rewind. Not years, decades. The global economy was built on an assumption. That efficiency equals security. That cheaper is safer. That markets will always correct themselves. They didn't. Production concentrated where costs were lowest. Processing clustered where regulation was lightest. Supply chains stretched across continents. For minerals, this logic was fatal. One country mined, another processed, a third consumed. No redundancy, no buffers. China stepped into that gap early, quietly, methodically. Rare earths, cobalt, battery inputs, processing technology. While others chased short-term profits, Beijing chased positioning. Control the middle of the supply chain, and you control everyone upstream and downstream. By the time demand surged driven by electrification, defense needs, and climate goals, the structure was locked in. Then came geopolitics. Export controls replaced free trade. Security replaced efficiency. Dependence became a liability. By 2025, scarcity was no longer theoretical. It was strategic. And once scarcity becomes political, it doesn't stay contained. It triggers reactions, countermeasures, and eventually crises. The first of those crises arrived quietly, not with explosions, but with paperwork. The paperwork landed in October. No press conference, no warning, just export controls. China didn't block minerals outright. It did something smarter. It restricted processing technology, components, magnets, the choke point. Suddenly, companies didn't lack raw materials. They lacked permission. Factories slowed, orders stalled, timelines slipped, not because demand fell, but because access vanished. This was the moment many policymakers missed. Power was no longer about possession. It was about authorization. According to official US assessments, 60 minerals are now considered critical, not optional. Critical. Defense systems depend on them. So do electric vehicles. So do phones, grids, and clean energy. When one country controls processing, leverage multiplies. Price manipulation becomes possible. Coercion becomes quiet. Disruption becomes deniable. This was not a trade dispute. It was a systems test, and the system failed. If you're finding this analysis useful, stay with me. These dynamics matter more than daily headlines, because this was only the first stress fracture. The deeper mechanism was still hidden. What looks like chaos is actually structure. The hidden mechanism is concentration, not just of minerals, but of stages. Mining is visible. Processing is not. Financing is invisible. Standards are political. Control one stage and you influence the rest. China doesn't just extract, it refines, it manufactures, it sets prices through scale, it shapes standards through dominance. This is why alternatives are slow. You cannot flip a switch and rebuild processing capacity. It takes permits, capital, skilled labor, years. The United States understood this late. So Washington changed tools, not slogans. Industrial policy, loans, guarantees, equity stakes, price floors, long-term purchase agreements at home and with allies. At the same time, diplomacy followed industry. G7 commitments, Quad coordination, bilateral financing deals across Asia. The goal is not independence. It is resilience. But resilience is expensive and slow, which creates a gap between intention and reality. That gap is where pressure builds, where consumers feel pain, where politics reacts. Because when governments try to rewire supply chains, someone always pays first. And in 2026, that payment shows up somewhere very familiar. Your receipt. The pressure didn't stop at factories. It moved to stores. Tariffs did that. At first, the cost was hidden. Importers absorbed it. Warehouses were full. Hope was high. Tariffs were supposed to be leverage, temporary, negotiable. They weren't. By mid-2025, reality set in. Tariffs stayed, deals locked them in. Exemptions narrowed. Importers adapted. They found new suppliers. They gained leverage. And then they passed the cost on quietly, gradually. Inevitably, by October, the burden shifted. Consumers paid the most, not governments, not exporters. Inflation crept up, not in spikes, in persistence. This is how policy becomes personal. Not through ideology, through prices. Tariffs are taxes with a delay. And delays are politically dangerous because when people feel squeezed without understanding why, trust erodes, spending slows, growth weakens. In the best case, the economy bends. In the worst case, it breaks into stagflation. This crisis wasn't loud. It was cumulative. And while households adjusted, another guardrail was quietly disappearing. One that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with survival. This is where the system reaches you, not as a statistic, as a feeling. You notice it at the checkout line. Prices that don't fall back, bills that stretch further, choices that narrow. But the deeper impact isn't just economic, it's psychological. When trade becomes a weapon, uncertainty becomes constant. When treaties expire, anxiety returns. When aid disappears, vulnerability multiplies. And for millions, especially women, the cost is immediate. Aid cuts don't hit abstractions. They hit clinics, food lines, shelters. Women in conflict zones lose healthcare first, family planning next. Safety last. This isn't collateral damage. It's predictable, Systems under stress push risk downward onto those with the least protection. If you're watching this from a place of stability, pause here, because global policy always arrives locally. Eventually, if this analysis helps you see that connection between power and people, share it. That's how understanding spreads. Because what happens next doesn't stay distant. It scales, it travels, and in 2026, these pressures don't stop at borders. What begins as domestic policy never stays domestic. Pressure moves. Mineral controls ripple through supply chains. Tariffs distort trade flows. Aid cuts destabilize fragile regions. Treaty collapse reshapes threat perceptions. One action triggers another. When the United States and Russia lose the last binding limit on nuclear weapons, uncertainty spreads. Transparency disappears. Verification ends. Both sides already hold enough weapons to destroy each other many times over. Limits were not about trust, they were about predictability. Without them, stockpiles can grow. Deployments can accelerate. Miscalculation becomes easier. Other countries are watching closely. China is expanding its arsenal, not recklessly, systematically. When major powers rearm, smaller ones hedge. Security dilemmas multiply. Accidents become more likely. At the same time, energy is reshaping geopolitics. Electricity replaces oil as leverage. Grids matter more than pipelines. Manufacturing replaces extraction. China's electrification surge doesn't just lower emissions. It shifts influence. Solar panels, batteries, electric vehicles. Exports become infrastructure for others. Dependence changes form. This is the new global equation. Less visible, more interconnected, and once systems lock in, they shape the future. Which leaves one question. Where does this trajectory lead? There are three paths ahead. None are guaranteed. All are plausible. The first is managed adjustment. Supply chains diversify slowly. Tariffs stabilize, then narrow. Arms competition pauses without formal treaties. Electric grids spread without full dependence. Aid partially returns through coalitions. The system strains, but it holds. This future is imperfect. More expensive, more fragmented, but stable enough. The second path is prolonged pressure. Mineral competition intensifies. Consumers absorb permanent tariff inflation. Nuclear arsenals grow quietly. Electrostates and petrostates compete for influence. Aid gaps harden into chronic crises. Nothing collapses, but nothing recovers. This is a world of constant tension, low trust, high risk, endless management. Then there is the third path. Fragmentation. Supply shocks trigger panic. Trade blocs harden, arms races accelerate. Energy dependence becomes coercion. Aid disappears entirely. In this world, systems don't fail at once. They fail unevenly. Some regions adapt, others unravel. History suggests something important here. Systems rarely choose extremes intentionally. They drift there. Which path emerges depends on decisions made quietly. Now, before crisis forces them, because the future isn't decided by one moment. It's decided by accumulation. And that brings us to the final insight. Here is the hard truth. 2026 will not announce itself as a turning point. It will feel like continuation. Prices still high, conflicts still distant, treaties gone, but headlines move on. Power grids expanding, aid lines shrinking. And yet, underneath, the world will be less reversible. Once supply chains harden, they don't easily unwind. Once arsenals grow, they don't easily shrink. Once systems abandon protection for the vulnerable, recovery takes generations. This is how power really works. Not through dominance, through design. Who controls minerals? Who sets tariffs? Who limits weapons? Who exports electricity? Who decides who gets help? These choices define the moral shape of the system. If you want to understand the world not as chaos, but as architecture, stay here. Subscribe. Share this with someone who feels the pressure but can't yet name it. Because the future isn't hidden, it's unevenly distributed. And once you see the structure, you can't unsee it. This is not the end of the story. It's the frame